and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy, your favorite daily public policy podcast from the Takshashila Institution. I'm Anushka Saxena, a research analyst with the Takshashila Institution's Indo-Pacific Studies program, and today I'm joined by my colleague from the program, Rakshith. And today I thought we can discuss a little bit about critical minerals and what really makes them so critical. What is it that India finds so strategic in at least 30 minerals that the Ministry of Mines has identified last year, and what does it mean for our internal capabilities vis-a-vis mining, extraction, and eventual use into products, right? What does this list of critical minerals spell for the industry when it comes to the domestic situation? And Rakshith's been doing a lot of work on this subject. He's also about to come up with a discussion document explaining the relevance of this list of critical minerals and what, of course, is the role that the elephant in the room, China, plays, or should I say the dragon in the room, China plays, right? So without further ado, Rakshith, let me start by talking to you a little bit about critical minerals themselves and what it is that makes them critical, what it is that makes them a bit different from maybe other minerals or elements in a similar chemical group, right? And I think the context for this conversation is also important because recently we've seen the United States Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security add maybe about 140 Chinese, Japanese, and South Korean entities to the so-called entity list. And China responded to that by placing export controls on some, again, critical minerals like gallium and germanium. And this is the second time China has undertaken such a move. So with this kind of context in mind, could you maybe start by talking about why is it that we should care about this group of elements?
Really great question. I mean, first of all, I mean, it depends on, whom you ask. I mean, which minerals are critical, right? EU has its own list of critical minerals, US has its own list, China has its own list, and finally, Ministry of Mines in 2023 came up with a list of 30 critical minerals for India. So the crux of the matter, how to differentiate a mineral which is critical and the others which are not. I think there are two parameters that at least European Union's methodology, while they were assessing their critical minerals, they have defined. One is the supply risk when it comes to sourcing the critical mineral itself, and second is the economic importance. And these are the exact two parameters that Ministry of Mines themselves have used while assessing minerals which are critical for India. So when the risk of supply shortage and the impact of this shortage in supply, basically its impact on the economy is relatively higher compared to other minerals, that mineral is termed as critical mineral. So it's as basic as that, two parameters, supply risk and economic impact on the nation. Also, I think minerals that we are labeling as critical is mostly because the path that we have identified as a way ahead in future, the decarbonization path. These minerals, most of them are really essential for developing clean energy technologies, modern technologies in defense, and basically to decarbonize the entire economy, right? So that's where the focus on these minerals as critical for a nation's development has come in forth. So I think that's why nations have their own list of minerals that are critical and which are really important in its economic development. So yeah.
Right. So clearly there's a very important sustainability angle, and from the perspective of India's, as you said, decarbonization goals, as well as for maybe other countries or entities that have critical minerals lists like the US and EU, you can see why it becomes important to take some of these elements seriously because they'll have such an important role to play in mitigating climate change, formulating sustainability strategies, and of course, in general, making sure that there is a robust economic kind of architecture that makes sourcing easy, because these entities also have a large chunk of populations to cater to as well, right? And in this regard, maybe we can zero in a little bit on India's critical minerals list. Can you tell me, in your understanding and your research, what is the logic or the strategy or the process rather which the Ministry of Mines deployed to come up with this list of 30 critical minerals from the Indian perspective? I know you talked a little bit about the two parameters that the EU used and then that those India adopted, but is there something more to it from the Indian perspective?
Right. So as I said before, Ministry of Mines in 2023 came up with the report. They set up a 6-member committee to assess how we're gonna come up with a list of critical minerals for India and that kind of stuff. So there was a 3 assessment test study. In the first assessment, they studied what other countries consider their own, I mean, how did they curate their own list of critical minerals for themselves. So first assessment test was much more of a exploratory research, trying to kind of understand why these minerals are critical for those economies. And the second assessment test, which I think was really amazing, was the interministerial consultations that MOM did with many ministries and departments like Ministry of New Renewable Energy, MEITY, and many other departments. And they were asked to submit their own list of minerals that they consider as critical. And after collating more than 50 or 70 minerals, finally they went to the third assessment parameter, which basically is a empirical formula borrowed from European Union, which again has 2 parameters: supply risk and the economic importance of the mineral for the nation. They ran all the minerals, like more than 50 minerals, to those empirical formula, and finally came up with the list of 30 critical minerals for India. So yeah, that's how Ministry of Mines actually did a very comprehensive study.
Right, that's quite an interesting process, and I mean, clearly it would have required a lot of bureaucratic pull through, because you mentioned a bunch of ministries were involved in the process, and I'm sure there must have been competing lists of critical minerals between maybe MIT, Commerce, so on and so forth, right? So I think in that sense, this can be considered at least a policy process success, right? That there was a priority on the table, which was to identify what to leverage and which kind of areas to narrow down on, and Ministry of Mines was able to pull that off. So that's very interesting. But of these 13 critical minerals on the list, I'm sure you would have an understanding of an opinion on which ones really matter in the short to medium term, in terms of how critical they may be to our national security goals, to our sustainability goals, or to something like consumer welfare, right? There must be some that we are highly dependent on, maybe when it comes to import, or we have significant, or we don't have significant domestic capabilities. So can you zero in a little bit on which those top priority elements may be, given that limited resources need to be invested in securing supply chains for India?
Right, exactly. So out of all the 30 minerals that at least India imports, so India is first of all 100% import dependent on more than 10 critical minerals. Okay. That's what the report mentions. But it's all around the world, right? So my focus was on China because I'm a part of China studies, and that's what Manoj pays me for. I mean, to work on China, right? So, but yeah, so within those list of 30 minerals, I saw, I mean, while analyzing the import data from the Ministry of Commerce website, I saw there are few minerals, as you said, that we are highly dependent on. Yeah. Bismuth being one of them. India India imports 85.6% of bismuth from China. It's an average import value since past 5 years. So, and then we import lithium from China. It's around 82%. And silicon, which is 76%, tellurium, which is 50%. So there are a list of 5 to 6 elements that we are highly dependent on. Right. And the benchmark for at least my study I have set is 40%. Okay. So wherever we import more than 40% from China, we are significantly dependent on them. But again, it's just the dependence that we are talking about, right? So we have this beautiful framework by Amit, which talks about how dependence leads to vulnerabilities and how to differentiate dependencies and categorize them in particular vulnerability.
Right.
So not all dependencies need to be strategically vulnerable for India, right? Few can be critically vulnerable, few can be strategically vulnerable, and few can just be dependencies. And
Right.
we can not focus on them. Rather, we can focus on those sectors or those segments where we have critical vulnerability, right? So I've run it through the six test framework that Amit has designed. So, and really great insights. So after running all the 30 minerals through the test, I found out that silicon, lithium and titanium, they emerge as critical vulnerabilities for India, right? They passed the first four tests, and the final two tests being national security tests and capability gap tests. We have a very high capability gap when it needs to process these minerals, and they are really important for our national security sectors. Like titanium, it's used in military production, advanced military production technologies. Silicon in EV grids, electric vehicles and electricity grids, and many other clean energy technologies, right? So there are a list of three that emerge as critical vulnerabilities, and other three, bismuth, tellurium and graphite, which emerge as strategic vulnerabilities and not are critical vulnerabilities. So I think this research provides a very good idea as to what should be our focus areas within those 30 critical minerals, where should be the immediate attention of the government should go on when it comes to reducing dependency on China. And yeah, that's what my document talks about.
Right. Sorry, and I think we missed it, but which three emerged as the critical vulnerabilities?
It's silicon, lithium, and titanium.
All right.
These three are critical vulnerabilities.
Right. So, one of the benchmarks you've talked about is how at least these six that are that pose critical and strategic vulnerabilities for India are those that India has a great dependence on China as well for, right? Import dependence. Can you maybe give us a little bit of insight into how China really made it possible? I mean, as I see it, and from what I read, it's not just India, but but there are many other countries in the world that are grappling with the question of de-risking their value and supply chains from China, and critical minerals figure on top when it comes to some of the supply chains under question in this de-risking game or strategy, right? And so, what are the numbers on China's dominance when it comes to some of the pillars of the critical mineral supply chains, and why do you think this has been made? Why do you think this kind of a dominance was possible for China to achieve?
Right. So a lot of research has already gone into dissecting what were the policy frameworks and subsidies given by the Chinese government to actually dominate the industry, critical mineral industry landscape. Just to get the numbers right and not give like false numbers when I'm actually being recorded on the video podcast, till the end of the year 2022, a total of 173 kinds of minerals have been discovered in China, including 13 kinds of energy minerals, 59 kinds of metallic minerals, 95 kinds of non-metallic minerals. And China is the world's largest producer of 28 different commodities. I'm talking about commodities, I'm talking about mineral commodities, 4 iron and ferro alloy metals, 14 non-ferrous metals, 7 industrial metals, and 2 mineral fuels. So that's the dominance of China when it comes to producing these kinds of minerals, right? And when we talk about investments, there has been a significant exploration investments in the past few years, with a total investment in geological exploration itself reaching 101 billion renminbi, or $14.18 billion USD.
That's quite a number.
Yeah, in 22 itself, and a 3.8% increase from the previous year. So it has been increasing. This investment surge led to the discovery of 132 new minerals actually in 22 itself. Yeah. So that's the number. And overall, globally, China produces around 28.4. I mean, China is the largest mining nation, and it mines almost at least 26 or 28% of mining. that happens, right? This is from the World Mining Data 2024. So they're pretty thorough with the numbers and that kind of stuff. And even International Energy Agency has came up with the report where they forecasted the processing dominance of China when it comes to these minerals. I mean, at least in copper, China processes at least 40 to 45% of copper processing. It's 60% of lithium. Nickel, it's around 35%. Cobalt, 75%. Graphite, 90% of processing happens in China, right? And for rare earth materials, it was 90% in 2020, but it came down to 75% in 20. I mean, it's projected to go to 75% in 2030.
Right.
So that's the best case scenario that IEA forecasts. So apart from that, I think one important thing where China actually cracked the code, in at least in this sector, is the processing, not the reserves, not the extraction.
Right.
For example, China only has 1% reserves of cobalt. It extracts that 1% as much as it can, but it has like around 65% of processing capability, right? When it comes to cobalt. So cobalt rich nations send their stuff to China, they process it, and then it goes back to others. So, I mean, when it comes to processing dominance, it's huge. 58% of aluminum processing happens in China, 42% of cadmium, as I said, 65% of cobalt, 58% of lithium, which is really crucial for green transition. So, I mean, that's the case. And again, just to tell you, I mean, the way they don't, so even when you analyze the 5-year plans and everything, right, they have been talking about investing in this sector, and you can trace it back to 2000s and 2005. So they have, it's been a long time that they have been talking about to dominate this sector and invest heavily, right? And it's mostly state subsidy investments. SOEs, state-owned enterprises, are heavily invested in mining, and even the environmental concerns for them is not huge, right? Unlike democratic nations like India, where people can actually come up and ask the mining corporations to take down the projects if it offers a huge social cost and environmental cost. In China, that's not the case. So SOEs benefit from it a lot. They have their own clusters where they can freely mine as much as possible. So a lot of investments in SOEs, a lot of investment in acquiring technology and developing in-house capability to process the metals and minerals. I think that's where they actually cracked the code when it came to dominate the
Really interesting. So it isn't enough that maybe we found reserves of lithium in Jammu and Kashmir, or if Bolivia sits on top of the largest lithium reserves in the world. You have to have processing capability to be able to make something out of those mined reserves, and then eventually send them into product lines, right? So I think, as you to turn your phrase.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because I wanted to talk about that, the reserve, the lithium block and reserves that we found in Jammu and Kashmir. It's in the form of clay deposits. And not only India, but globally, we don't have the technology to extract lithium from clay deposits and send it to the industries. So even the form of deposits that these minerals are in plays a huge role when it comes to extracting it and processing it. So it's a really big disadvantage for us given the amount of lithium that we found. But yeah, we are working on developing the technology to extract that form of deposits and that kind of stuff. But again, as you rightly said, processing plays a big role, because it doesn't matter where it comes from. Ultimately, it has to get processed to make it usable, right? So, and China does a great job in that.
And on the top of your head, can you think of other factors or other maybe hindrances that dissuade India from being able to enter the processing market? Of course, I understand that China must have established that competitive advantage or competitive pricing market, and you said it yourself. Cobalt-rich nations would mine cobalt and send it to China for processing. But what areas aside from this competition warrant intervention when it comes to India developing in-house extraction or processing capabilities?
So apart from the lithium thing, I mean, the lithium deposits that we found in Jammu and Kashmir, unfortunately, the form that we found in clay deposits, I think 3 more reasons that I find makes it really difficult for India to actually, so makes it makes India to import heavily, basically,
Right.
when it comes to these kinds of minerals. India is, first of all, it's a mineral rich country, we know that, right?
Right.
But only a small percentage of these minerals, basically, or resources have been converted to mineable reserves. And this is
Right.
not the case in China. I mean, they find a deposit, they turn it into a mine pretty quickly when it comes to the time span, right? Heavy investments goes in. There's a lot of support from the state and that kind of stuff. Second, many critical minerals are deep seated, which requires high risk investments in exploration and mining.
Right.
And the state honestly doesn't have the capacity and the capital to
Right.
invest that kind of amount. We need to involve private sector in this.
Right.
And the recent auctions of many critical mineral blocks and even the offshore critical mineral blocks that India has recently pitched in. I mean, it's a great step, but it's a long battle that we need private capital in this sector.
Right.
That's why India is doing poorly. And third is the domestic processing capacity, which I mentioned, is only available in few countries. And also, in-house, we have domestic processing capability for only few minerals. For example, copper, zinc, and graphite. We have processing capability for these three minerals. And also, it makes the job really difficult when these minerals are found in different forms, non-ideal forms, basically,
Right.
which makes the entire job difficult. So yeah.
Understandable. Really interesting. So, I think so far in the conversation, we have an idea of what critical minerals are and what makes them critical. How the mining in ministry came to this list of 30 critical minerals and which of those are maybe really urgently important in the short to medium term, the six that we discussed as per Amit's HPDF framework pose critical and strategic vulnerabilities. And we've also been able to establish that there are real reasons why China has been able to secure a certain dominance in each process or pillar of the critical mineral supply chain, and where maybe India's shortcomings lie with in terms of being able to quickly turn a deposit into a mine, being able to develop processing capabilities, especially for different types of forms through which the minerals will have to be extracted. So I think we have a lay of the land in terms of uh, what the nature of this domain looks like. Maybe I think I'd want to quiz you on one final aspect, which should be a huge chunk of our thinking as a policy research think tank, right? Which is, so what can India do next? What India's policy options look like, and especially when it comes to mitigating import dependence. I think developing in-house processing, inculcating private capital, stuff like that will be maneuvers that the policy apparatus is already thinking about. But when it comes to de-risking imports, what are the ways in which India can start thinking about alternatives, and which elements should India start focusing on first on the basis of its market requirements and industrial capacity as well?
Right. Let me give you a very generic answer. Diversify sources, find alternative suppliers, invest heavily domestically.
Yeah.
These are the, answers that are out there. But I think we need to be more specific with our policy recommendations.
Right.
And after multiple consultations and talkings with the folks at Takshashila themselves, have got some like really good ideas in-house, which will come out in the paper.
Right.
Firstly, I think we can focus on recycle. So unlike fossil fuels, critical minerals can be recycled, right?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Right.
Especially in the case of lithium, the combination of right sizing EV batteries, alternative chemistries, and recycling could reduce the demand by 25% in 2030.
Okay.
So that's the role of recycling that plays when it comes to reducing dependency on others, right? So I think even before, so while we are investing heavily on exploration, mining, and processing, we should also focusing on recycling capabilities.
Right.
And producing batteries and end products which can be recyclable. I think this is a really cool way to actually reduce dependency in future.
Interesting.
Right? Another step India has taken is that it launched, there's a joint venture called Kabil. It's called Khanidesh, Khanji Bidesh India, something. They came up in 2019. It's a joint venture among few central public sector enterprises. And Kabul is basically tasked to look and acquire extraction and processing facilities. So it's talking with Australia and many other countries to source reserves for itself. So that's a cool stuff. Second thing, the offshore mineral block auction that we took. That we talked about is another great thing that India did. I mean, it came up with 13 offshore mineral block auctions. Let's see how it goes, because the last mineral auction was kind of a dampener. Not a lot of bidders actually showed interest in it. There's a whole list of other reasons for that, why private sectors are skeptical in investing and that kind of stuff. But again, these two things are the steps in right direction. So yeah, I think India is taking cognizance of the needs and the threats that China poses when it comes to controlling its critical mineral exports, and India is already taking steps to do it. But my one core recommendation is, let's please start focusing on recycling already, so that we don't get heavily dependent in future.
Right, interesting. And just one quick follow-up before we end this very interesting conversation. Have you been able to identify in the course of your research a few other countries which can fulfill India's reserve requirements when it comes to some of these six critical minerals, or countries where India can go to if it needs support with processing, and which can maybe provide a viable alternative, at least in one or a couple sets of minerals for India?
Right. So as I said, when it comes to lithium, China is not the largest producer of lithium. It's Australia. And we have like significant lithium reserves in Chile also, right? But at the end of the day, and even in other minerals, cobalt, again, China is not the major producer.
Right.
We have different countries, but at the end of the concern is the high switching cost that we have, right? When we are planning to import it from countries which are very, very far, and where the entire extraction process is costlier than China. China does it at an amazing low price. I mean, the entire process. It's a high switching cost for us, which is stopping us to actually go full into diversification mode.
Right.
Which is understandable, because ultimately it will be the consumers who will be ending up paying much more for the end products.
Right.
So, but there are countries available to source many of the critical minerals that India has listed for itself. But the end of the problem is, it'll be expensive, and ultimately everything has to go to China to get processed and then come back to India. So until unless we do something about the processing capability, I don't think we can focus much more on the sourcing part of it.
Right. A very important point, actually. I do think that exercises like the ones you've undertaken in your upcoming discussion document are useful to at least narrow down minerals where we need to invest resources urgently. So if they're critical to national security and there is a high switching cost, I think that could be beneficial in the medium to long term. But at the same time, if there can be a way forward to exchange know-how on processing, if Australia is indeed the biggest miner of lithium, it must also be invested in processing capabilities. So if there can be something on the India-Australia front with regards to exchange of know-how or joint development of processing capabilities, that could go a long way in kind of addressing the de-risking question. Right? So thank you so much for that, Rakshith.
My pleasure.
Really meaningful insights, and I'd recommend our listeners and viewers to keep watching the Takshashila Institution space for Rakshith's upcoming document on assessing India's critical mineral priorities and developing a de-risking strategy for the same. Thank you so much, Rakshith, and thank you to our listeners for tuning into another episode of All Things Policy.